Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast for the third time is Matthew Pines. He is a management consultant at Krebs Stamos, but he is here in a personal capacity. In the past, Matt and I have talked about cybersecurity and U.S. China relations, and while we spend a few opening minutes discussing some recent development in U.S. China cyber relations, I brought Matt back on the podcast because I had promised in the last podcast that I would let him talk for more than 5 minutes about UFOs or UAPs or aliens, whatever word you want to put in there. And I have to admit, I've done a lot of research over the past couple of weeks preparing for this podcast, and as you'll hear in the podcast, I'm not willing to tell you that there are aliens out there, that there's some huge U.S. conspiracy or cover-up. But something is weird about this. It is weird the level of political activity that's happening in the United States around this topic, and it opens itself up to speculation. So we try to do that in a reasoned and rigorous way and talk about what we do know, what we don't know, why some of these things are happening politically, and also letting ourselves go into a scenario analysis mode, which is, well, what if this is true? What does that look like? And also with some methodological considerations about how to think about something that is such a big tail risk that is probably so unlikely to be true, but which you can't deny there are these facets about. So I hope you enjoy the episode. If you want to hear more about the research and advisory services that we offer at Cognitive Investments, or if you want to learn more about how to invest with us or get access to our wealth management strategies, it's jacob@cognitive.investments. If you haven't rated or reviewed the podcast, please consider doing so. Otherwise, enough from me. Cheers and see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. Before we get there, and this is not a bait and switch, listeners, I would be remiss if I didn't do just 5 minutes of U.S. China stuff off the bat. In part because there was that big New York Times article this weekend about how China has malware and a bunch of U.S. power infrastructure and things like that. They're purging the PLA rocket force, but are ties between the U.S. and China getting better because it looks like the White House is walking back some of the restrictions. So I'll let you riff on any or all of the above. I just wanted to get your take specifically on that scary story about Chinese malware being in our power infrastructure, and more generally how you're feeling about U.S.-China relations.
Yes, I think that was an important story, if not surprising. The details, I think, were surprising to the mass audience, but from a just deterrence and compellence perspective, it's fully in keeping with PLA doctrine that they would want to achieve persistence on networks that would give them the ability to either credibly deter the United States from intervening in a Taiwan conflict scenario, and if the United States does decide to intervene, the ability to sort of compel us or degrade our ability to sort of mobilize our capabilities and generally gum up the works domestically, and potentially change the political calculations at home. So not surprising. I think there's a reason why it was sort of published when it was published is, there's been a lot of kind of digging around domestically to try to find these types of penetrations. If you recall, there was a story a few months ago about Volt Typhoon, which was a PLA-attributed actor that had conducted similar operations focused on Guam, but other parts of what you could call critical infrastructure, telecommunications, and other elements of kind of civilian infrastructure that would support military operations. So this is sort of broadening the aperture from that particular story, but it's keeping into the theme. And I would have to say, not considered, at least from our perspective, an attack or an actual escalation, but what you would expect to be kind of a prudent prepositioning, given where the relationship is. One potential scenario, right? This is more speculative, is thinking about where the PLA can achieve relative strategic advantages, where they can continue to kind of keep their population relatively controlled if our retaliation for civilian infrastructure attacks domestically via cyber enabled means hits them, it's not as much of a big deal domestically. Whereas for us, we need Netflix, we need air travel, we need the basics to keep functioning before people go, we're gonna rise up. And so it's a smart strategy. It's what you would expect. I think the United States is drawing a specific attention to it as part of this large sort of diplomatic tension that I think you're seeing inside DC between two different camps. There's kind of the engagement camp and the escalation containment camp. And they've sort of waxed and waned over the past, year or so, especially as we saw kind of a nadir reached post October 7th semiconductor controls, and then the Blinken visit being canceled after the balloon incident. And there was a general perception of kind of a security dilemma deterioration that I think really spooked big money and sort of parts of the U.S. political economy that were not happy with the direction of travel of U.S. China relations. And then if you notice, there was a flurry of senior level visits, starting in the private sector principally. You had Elon Musk, you had Jamie Dimon, you had Bill Gates, you had Sam Altman, you had like a whole host of folks, not official government representatives going over there to kind of like keep bridges, open. And then the CIA director, Bill Burns, did a clandestine visit, I think, in May. And that set the groundwork for a whole series of more official engagements. Secretary Yellen, most importantly, after Secretary Blinken, that tried to put a floor, quote unquote, under the relationship, which I think thus far, they've been successful at. I think there's a strategic desire on both sides to prevent something from spiraling out of control. President Xi has his own house to kind of clean up, both economically as well as he has certain, I think, political objectives inside the bureaucracy now that he's kind of come out of the party Congress with a renewed kind of internal mandate, and now he's executing on that mandate, and he's doing some pretty dramatic reshuffling, as we've seen in the the foreign ministry and now in the rocket forces. He's trying to consolidate control with loyalists, and then as sometimes you run across cases like the foreign minister where stuff happens inside the CCP bureaucracy, and everyone's just kind of guessing.
I thought he was a loyalist. Apparently not.
I mean, there's lots of I mean, you can imagine there's probably like two people in the world that know like the true story of that, and one of them probably will never talk again. And so I think that's where we are now. I think there's a desire, at least on a political level, to try to get things back to an even keel. Maybe get to a point where there can be a meeting between the two leaders later this year, like in November. We'll see if that happens. But I think they want to try to keep anything that could throw a monkey wrench into that off the table, which is why I think they're trying to soften or slow roll some of these maneuvers while also placating kind of that domestic decoupling lobby. So the executive order on outbound investment screening, which essentially the reverse CFIUS, which should be coming out imminently, first week of August. It's already kind of been reported. It's on the president's desk waiting to be signed. We'll be pretty limited and narrow in scope and targeting kind of early stage investments in AI, semiconductors, and quantum information sciences. And I think this won't be I expect it to be signed or released on a Friday afternoon, right? I don't think the White House will be drawing too much attention to it, which I think would be is a different messaging shift than they had done back in the October 7th controls, when the National Security Advisor gave a whole speech, and it was this is the centerpiece of a new kind of strategic orientation for techno-industrial competition with China, and that was perceived by Beijing as almost declaration of economic war, and it was all right, the gloves are off now. And I think things might have gotten a little bit out of hand earlier in the spring. But we're only one accident away from all that coming unglued, right? One drone crashing into one of our spy planes, or fighter jet crashing into one of our spy planes, or some confrontation in the South China Sea between a frigate and a destroyer, and then you're in bad news land.
Last question before we leave this. So Chinese malware in U.S. infrastructure systems. Are we doing this to them as well? Are there two equivalents of us doing a Chinese podcast talking about this on their side, being oh, the U.S. is infiltrated the Three Gorges Dam, and if there's a war in Taiwan, they're going to shut everything down? Do we have that kind of offensive capability that we're employing, to your knowledge?
I mean, the details are, of course, classified. I mean, aware of that the U.S. Cyber Command has a doctrine called persistent engagement and defend forward, which is predicated on being in the adversary's networks to maintain persistence so that if the commander-in-chief gives the order to disrupt or degrade those networks, that they can do that effectively. And in a modern, sort of war planning scenario, there's sort of general like rules of engagement, like what's considered like a viable target for any military operation. And, in general, there's like a set of decision criteria, right? Like pure military targets are usually considered kosher. And then there's like ambiguous gray zone targets, right? That might be considered enabling infrastructure for military operations. And there's always like a cost benefit calculation of what are the spillover effects to, say, civilian population, life and safety, sort of collateral damage that goes into those, assessments about whether those are permissible targets under different, sort of battlefield conditions. And so, but as a matter of like having capabilities to execute, right, you would expect that the Cyber Command would want to have the capabilities to, disrupt and degrade, Chinese infrastructure, when and if ordered in a conflict. Which is what we saw the PLA doing here. Is like we want to have access to those networks. We want to be able to maintain persistence so that if their commander gives the order, they can effectively disrupt them.
When you said military targets are kosher, I'm now thinking of the kashrut of military targets and hoping that my years spent in yeshiva can actually be used in some kind of analysis that is worthwhile now, but probably not.
It is. Move. I mean, well, one last point. It is very. Yeah. It's a much more complex thing than say like bombing targets, right? Where it's like, okay, hospital off limits, school off limits, churches off limits, military headquarters, good to go, right? There's like a clear delineation that you're only going to find, and you can contain the damage. The nature of cyber attacks is you're degrading kind of enabling infrastructure that's like fundamentally dual use, right? Like transportation infrastructure, communications infrastructure, and you can't exactly know ahead of time what all those spillover effects are going to be, right? Like whether you've just like basically cut off the power to that hospital and now an entire, ward of babies is going to have like, major health problems, right? Because you just like, killed this like the life-sustaining functions of the hospital. And that is a very complicated decision. I think in general, like my expectation is that we would probably be a little bit more hesitant to expand the targeting range than China would be. But, when you're in a full-scale conflict and it's about, something as existential as a fight over Taiwan, potentially, it could get quite messy.
Yeah. All right, let's move to the main topic of conversation. I've done some reading and some research. I'm still very skeptical, but maybe let's start here. Let's just talk about what's happened in the last week or so, and then maybe we can zoom out and give some macro perspective and get down to some of the questions. So maybe do you want to sort of set up what this congressional hearing about? Is it UAPs is the politically correct term, right? I'm not supposed to say UFOs anymore. People are getting very, very sensitive about how you call these things. But talk a little bit about the congressional hearing and what we learned or what was different or was anything surprising to you there?
Yes, UAP is the official term of art in government parlance, but of course in pop culture it's UFO, and they mean the same thing. And even in the statutory language that was just passed, the National Defense Authorization Act, where they define UAPs as unidentified anomalous phenomenon, they like helpfully put in like what we mean by that, and they mean flying saucer, flying discs, unidentified flying objects, right? Like they explicitly reference what are the sort of semantic categories that they mean to cover by the term UAP. So there's no ambiguity in what the law is intended to be scoped to. But that is, so a good segue to the summary of the most recent events, as this sort of has broken through a little bit into the mainstream, kind of the Overton window of what we consider kind of, official policy discourse. I think UAPs and UFOs were sort of clearly outside that Overton window, and it's like they're kind of knocking on the window, right? They're kind of like kind of maybe coming inside. They're just kind of on the precipice here. And so we saw a hearing in the House Oversight Committee where they had two witnesses, both former naval aviators, as well as one whistleblower from the intelligence community. And I think his testimony is the most explosive and potentially controversial. That's like the specific allegations that the U.S. government has had crash retrieval and reverse engineering programs of non-Earth origin exotic technology, that's not of human origin, for decades, and that we have recovered, quote, biologics associated with those crash retrievals, and that we have a very kind of closely held and potentially illegal set of special access programs that have evaded congressional oversight and that have funded themselves like illicitly through manipulation of federal acquisition regulations, IRAD programs, and other means of sort of financial shenanigans. And so this is sort of the core allegation that was surfaced at the hearing, under oath in the presence of the members of Congress's questioning. And it comes in the context of other official statements by members of Congress, specifically members of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, over the past few weeks and months, as well as, more importantly, from my perspective, pieces of legislation, actual text in bills that the Senate has now passed as of last week, July 27th, in the Combined National Defense Authorization Act, Intelligence Authorization Act. And that is a particular, more revealing to me of what might be happening here that needs to be analyzed in light of what David Grush alleged in his testimony. Very wild claims, basically David Grush was essentially putting weight behind the core of the whole multi-decade kind of cultural conspiracy about Roswell, and that alien craft have actually been recovered, and that the U.S. government has been keeping it a secret, and that they've been actively trying to sort of disenfranchise public opinion, was the words that David Grush used. And so this is kind of like a pretty high stakes claim that is being made by someone with prima facie professional bona fides. He was a very senior intelligence official in the National Reconnaissance Office, National Judicial Intelligence Agency. He was responsible for helping to put together the President's Daily Brief on behalf of the Director of the National Reconnaissance Office. And in that role, he had exceptionally broad access to the Defense Department's special access programs. And it was because of that broad access and his experience as an intelligence official with responsibilities expanding into the UAP portfolio, he was tapped in 2019 to be the UAP task force representative from I think it was the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Mm-hmm. And so he was sort of in this role for about 3 or 4 years, where he was tasked, as a result of congressional pressure on the Defense Department, to stand up this task force to go and figure out, what does the Defense Department know about these UAP stuff, right? And so he did his job. He's like, all right, this is my job. I now have all the tickets, which is in sort of in DoD parlance, I have the clearances to get access to all these different compartmented programs. And now he has the need to know, having this official position as the co-lead on this task force. And so he went out and conducted a whole bunch of interviews and collected documentation that, according to him, revealed to him the existence of these covert programs that were being conducted outside of congressional oversight. And that is kind of where we stand now with those claims. That's David Grush's claims. We can pivot it, but I'll let you pause there. But then there's the legislation piece, which I think needs its own analysis.
Yeah, we can shift there too. I mean, I would just point, after Grush made all of those comments, Sean Kirkpatrick, who's the director of AARO, put out his own statement, but in his personal capacity, not in his sort of official capacity. And I guess it was trying to delegitimize all the things that had come out in the hearing. But when you actually, and that was sort of the newspaper articles came out, oh, Kirkpatrick does this, and the Pentagon spokesperson says this. But when you actually read the letter, I mean, he says, I'm deeply disappointed that AARO has been denigrated, blah, blah, blah. But the only sentence in there about refuting the claims is, AARO has yet to find any credible evidence to support the allegations of any reverse engineering program for non-human technology. That's it. So, I mean, that's a pretty... So, for that's not denying that there's, for example, biologics that the government is hiding. It also is just have not found any credible evidence. I mean, it's about as mealy-mouthed a denial as you could possibly get. So when you start to pull back the... I don't know what Kirkpatrick was doing there. To me, he just opened up more questions rather than actually delegitimizing the hearing. And and I guess that's the other thing here. I'm struck by two different things. There are aliens, little child bodies and metallic objects that the government is hiding, versus there are government programs and government funding that is going to investigate a bunch of stuff that nobody knows about. I'm very willing to believe that the latter is happening. I'm going to need a lot more evidence to believe that the former is happening, but it's not Kirkpatrick's letter in some ways made me stop and start thinking about this even more seriously, when I feel like the intent was the opposite.
Yeah, and it's quite, if there was nothing here, it'd be a very straightforward thing to have like a pretty comprehensive and blanket denial of the substance of these claims. And yet, time after time, whether it's Kirkpatrick or Susan Goh, who's the DoD director, who's the DoD kind of public affairs spokesman for this, or even the White House, which basically has the exact same talking points from Susan Goh's office, they're very like weaselly worded, right? Which it's like, it's very odd to me. I'm like, it should be very easy to just have a blanket statement that's like, no, U.S. government has no knowledge, awareness of, or has no programs at all relating to non-human origin advanced technology. Just like put it there. Instead, they have these like credible evidence of extraterrestrial technology, which is like, that implies, and I think David Grush even said this in his testimony, like extraterrestrial implies there's a known origin. We know it's from this, from Alpha Centauri or whatever. And, unless it comes with a sticker on it that says made off planet, right? Like, what would be credible evidence of extraterrestrial? So it's like, it's setting the bar extremely high, but writing it in the context that implies it's like a fundamental denial of the core claim, which, as you mentioned, being a fellow philosopher, undergrad, paying attention to the specific semantics is important in these things. Which tells me, okay, it's important to pay attention to the subtext here, right? What is not being said when they're saying these things? And importantly, what's the role of AARO in this whole process, which is something the Senate was, and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence is like, they are the most important, actor in this whole drama, right? Like, they're at the center of this because it was their legislation that created AARO in the first place. It's their, skiffs that all these witnesses, including David Grush, have gone to give this testimony alleging the existence of these programs. And so if you look over the past 2 to 3 years, the pattern that I observe is things happening out of view, and then the Senate Subcommittee on Intelligence passes, I think almost every single time unanimously, a set of UAP-related provisions to include in either the NDAA or the IAA that require the official reporting of UAP-related identifications and reports to Congress and to the public, mandate a whole bunch of historical reviews of the U.S. government's efforts on this going back to 1945. And every NDA that's been passed, they've sort of ratcheted up the scope and intensity of the legislative requirements on this issue, which is like a trend that's worth noticing. It's like over the past 2 to 3 years, as the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, like probably the most important element of our congressional oversight structure for the most secret programs we have, has not been treating this with dismissal or like as a casual side project. Like, they've only gotten more and more serious, and the legislative maneuvers that they've engaged in have only gotten more and more expansive over time. And so I see, that's like indirect evidence that like whatever is motivating that must be sufficiently strong to get, on a bipartisan basis, the entire Senate Select Committee on Intelligence to unanimously approve these quite eye-opening pieces of bill text, and then to have them be incorporated without objection into larger packages that are now passed by the larger Congress and signed by the president. That's happened for 2 consecutive National Defense Authorization Act, and I think we've reached kind of like a culmination point with this most recent NDA, which has some just absolute, just like jaw-dropping language in it, right? Like, if people actually read what their representatives are putting into law, it's kind of almost insanity-inducing, right? Like they actually have language defining like what technologies of unknown origin means. And if you look at it, it just says the term technologies of unknown origin means any materials or metamaterials, ejecta, crash debris, mechanisms, machinery, equipment, assemblies or sub-assemblies, intact aerospace vehicles, damaged or intact ocean surface undersea craft associated with UAP, or incorporating science and technology that lacks prosaic attribution or known means of human manufacture. And there's another provision that actually restricts funding to any unreported special access program, and it defines like basically those sorts of programs as basically any activities related to UAPs, including capturing, recovering, or securing UAP craft or components of this craft, analyzing them for the purpose of determining properties, material composition, managing and providing security for those materials, reverse engineering and replicating their technology, The development of, quote, propulsion technology or aerospace craft that uses propulsion technology systems or subsystems that is based on or derived from or inspired by inspection, analysis, reverse engineering of recovered UAP. And then any aerospace craft that uses propulsion technology other than chemical propellant, solar power, or electronic ion thrust. And then they have a separate section, which is the real crazy part, which is like they have to turn over to the director of Aero, and then he has to notify Congress within 30 days. All such, basically a comprehensive list of, quote, all non-Earth origin or exotic, unidentified, anomalous phenomenon material. So the words non-Earth origin or exotic, unidentified, anomalous material are now in the Senate-passed NDAIA that's supposed to go to the president's desk once it gets merged with the House version in the fall, which is like, I don't know, but like that's crazy to me, right? Like, why would that be? Oh, and this is the kicker. So I'll finish with this one, because this is the one that is just really like, nuts. So the term non-human intelligence, I think, appears 22 times in the package of the language that the majority leader of the Senate, Senator Schumer, introduced, co-sponsored with Senator Rounds, and it was co-sponsored by many other bipartisan members of the House, of the Senate, including the Senate Armed Services Committee and Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. It's like 60 pages of legislation that is designed, unlike the SSCI introduced provisions, which were designed to basically like much more narrowly like kind of like hit these rogue special access programs that are alleged to have been conducting reverse engineering of these retrieved, non-Earth origin exotic technologies. That's the SSCI introduced provisions, which are relatively short, narrowly scoped. The Schumer bill basically is like literally called the UAP Disclosure Act. And it's like 60 pages of very like tightly written congressional text. Like it's got all the lawyer typical congressional stuff in it. Clearly they had a bunch of staffers working on this for a long time. And it was introduced kind of completely by surprise. It didn't come out of a committee. It didn't come out of like a pattern of like hearings or they bring in witnesses. It was just like the Senate majority leader is just like, hey guys, I'm going to drop this like UAP disclosure bill, and I'm going to have, it basically sets up like a commission to officially collect all the UAP related records in the government that exist. And it gives this commission the status of a federal agency and powers of subpoena and like blanket ability to basically ask for any document, material, or anything basically that at all relates to UAPs. And they have a very like whole set of provisions to like define what that really means in terms of non-human intelligence related technologies of unknown origin. Like it's in the law. To set up a 9-member commission appointed by the president that are Senate confirmed positions that will have tenure through 2030, 7-year term, and basically set up like a JFK style review commission to officially collect and then selectively decide to disclose to the public these UAP records with the goal of informing the public of the federal government's historical involvement with UAPs going back, as long as those records exist. And in the, I don't want to like belabor the point, but like the legislation to me is like way more important than even David Grush. David Grush is very important to me, but like it's firsthand hearsay. He's making these claims, very strong claims under oath, but he hasn't brought forward, what I would consider dispositive evidence. Like it's very important to investigate his claims, give the Congress the authority to go and knock on the door of the whatever Lockheed facility the stuff is supposed to be in, open the door. Is it there or is it not there? Like, I don't know. But where that rubber meets the road is like actually having the tangible authorities to do that. And that's actually what these bills are designed to do. Because one of the provisions in the Schumer bill gives the government a claim of eminent domain over any non-Earth origin, exotic technology of unknown origin associated with non-human intelligence, to claim for the federal government to basically repossess under its eminent domain authorities for the public good any of those technologies that might be held in private aerospace, essentially. This is what's written into the law that was just passed by the Senate last week. And I'm just like, that to me is just like mind-boggling, right? Like, and this has been reported. Like every mention I've seen of the Schumer bill is just to become more transparent with the public on UAPs. It's just like a one-line throwaway. Because I don't think people have actually read the text of the bill. It's quite dense. But if you read it, it's kind of insane. Like this is basically the government, at least the Senate, coming out and basically saying, yeah, we're pretty sure there are these things that we need to designate as being covered by the terms technology of unknown origin, and that relate to, quote, non-human intelligence. And they have like a whole definition of what that means, and it's basically, yeah, aliens is what they're saying. It's like, and I guess people haven't quite picked up on it yet. Yeah, this is the part I was looking for. This is in the text that was just passed last week. Non-human intelligence, section 13. The term non-human intelligence means any sentient, intelligent, non-human life form, regardless of nature or ultimate origin, that may be presumed responsible for unidentified anomalous phenomena or of which the federal government has become aware.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I laughed because when you said eminent domain over alien technology, the hubris of a government saying, yes, this alien technology we will just claim under eminent domain. There's something so rich about that. And I think it's important to dwell, because you're right, there's the politics and then there's the aliens. And I think we'll get to the aliens a little bit later. But the politics of this is so strange because, I mean, you mentioned it, but I think it deserves underscoring. So it's Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, with Mike Rounds, Republican from South Dakota, with Marco Rubio, Republican from Florida, Kristen Gillibrand, Democrat from New York. Then you've got a Senate Republican from Indiana, Democrat from New Mexico. We can't get gun control in this country. We can't get education. We can't get infrastructure. We can't get nuclear reactors built. But we can somehow, everybody can say, oh, we're going to stop calling each other fascists for 5 minutes here. Well, probably more than 5 minutes, and come up with this really, really intricate bill because everybody, Republicans and Democrats, needs to get on board with understanding this. And I don't know whether that's just, is that bread and circuses? Do they know that this is like a thing that's going to distract from their complete and utter incompetence in both houses, which is how I would describe it? Or is it like they actually know something? Do they feel like they're being subverted? I don't know. And the last part of this is I can't help, I don't know if she was a congresswoman or a senator, but that hearing where she stopped the questioning to ask what a Substack was. The idea that we've got, people who don't even know what a Substack is, they're going to be claiming eminent domain over non-human technology. Like I don't even know how to process all of this.
No, I wouldn't expect anyone to try to process this or put into any sort of coherence. And I think one thing we should try to do is try to resist the need to try to impose prematurely some coherent narrative to this. Because at first blush, it just resists that. And I don't think you should try to force one onto it, whether it's the psyop, distraction, or even if it's the ultimate underlying truth of hiding non-Earth origin exotic technology. Like, it could be very complicated, and I think there could be many overlapping motives by many different actors at play, because you could have like the sort of sci-fi plot and then overlay that the normal bureaucratic plots of people trying to protect interest, seizing a public issue for their own aggrandizement, just pure old greed. I want that. I want this technology. I don't want anyone else to have it. Yeah. And so I think in general, what you would expect isn't like the Hollywood trope. What you would expect, even if this is like the sci-fi core plot, you would expect there to be just the overlapping normal bureaucratic and human nonsense, right, that goes along with it, which makes it very hard to disentangle, right, like what's going on, because it seems to just be a messy, complicated beast where the folks that I pay a lot of attention to, the weather vanes in this, aren't necessarily, I give them credit, right, as far as it goes, whether it's Representative Burchett or Luna, these folks in the House. But honestly, they're on the outside looking in, and they saw this as an issue to get, to sort of wield, get their moment in the sun. And, they got the hearing, and I think it was a very important hearing. But let's be honest, they're not at the center of the official maneuvers behind the scenes when it comes to the introduction of this language, which is being driven by an entirely other set of stakeholders, mostly in the Senate, who they are very solemn and serious, and the language in the bill is very, very serious. And that makes it very hard to reconcile with a normal approach to the circus of politics in D.C., which, generally speaking, does not seem all that serious. And yeah, I mean, one of the points that is what was remarkable to me was Representative Gallagher. He, of course, he's the chair of the China Select Committee. He's a relatively new, up and coming Republican, kind of moderate Republican, defense hawkish kind of guy. Probably has presidential aspirations, Marine intelligence officer, PhD, kind of checks all those boxes from Wisconsin. He went on a syndicated kind of sports podcast talk show, which has like, it's like one of the, I think it's the Pat McAfee show. It's like, everyone watches it for like, like NFL draft picks and stuff. And they invite him on, and he's got like a 45 minute segment a few weeks ago. And it's explicitly designed, to set him up to talk about UAPs the entire time. It's just the NFL guys basically talking to him about aliens. And so here's a guy who otherwise has a pretty serious portfolio, right? Like, and he's like, his main, issue du jour has been China competition, CCP bad, kind of prepare for Taiwan war, get them ready. That's like been his thing. And now he's like, spends 45 minutes just talking about UAPs on this like sort of, basically the flyover country. And he explicitly said his objective is to try to normalize this subject. And he went there in coordination with an interview that Marco Rubio had just done the day before, where Marco Rubio basically kind of nodded at the whistleblower claims and saying these are very serious, and that some of these witnesses are fearing incredibly for their lives as a result of having come to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and given evidence and testimony of these programs. And so they're taking it very seriously. But Gallagher, who goes on this talk radio show to explicitly try to normalize this subject, basically says he wants to get it into the presidential conversation. So I just look at all this and I see there's like an apparatus, this superstructure trying to be formed to allow politicians to more officially engage with the subject, right? And you can see there's like an invisible superstructure that's being laid. First by people in positions of credibility, but it's like an inch, building the bridges and building that superstructure kind of inch by inch, and then getting this commission stood up. And this is like the more formal kind of like, okay, now we're gonna start to roll things out. Now, what does that all mean? Like, until they come and show me, the technologies of unknown origin, right? Like, again, it's all circumstantial inference, right? But it's quite a bizarre one. It's quite a bizarre one. It's like, to what end, right? Is this all happening? It makes one has to sort of at least pay attention. I don't think you can ignore this.
No, I don't think you can ignore it either, even though, I was very, very skeptical at first, but I've come around to your position that we at least need to be talking about it. I keep on thinking about the brothers Karamazov and the Grand Inquisitor chapter, and that maybe they have an alien like somewhere in the bowels of the Pentagon, and they're like, I've come to bring peace and unlimited power to mankind. They're like, that's great, but like you just have to sit here in this dungeon and we'll like feed you Cheez-Its or something like that until we're ready for you. But I think that is a good segue, because there's all this weird stuff. Like, we're seeing all these political machinations. We've got all these stories. You've got investigative journalists, who wrote In Plain Sight? Ross
Coulthart.
Coulthart, like, making all these claims. It's well researched. It's backed up. All these other things, but there's no alien craft. There's no actual evidence. And I actually went down a rabbit hole here. I sort of went back to Roswell. I was seeing like newspapers from the late 1940s. Like, here's a headline. This could have been written, just the other day, but more flying saucers seen as men of science ponder serious angles. And then here's a whole article by the Associated Press in 1947, which is basically just a recap of like what's going on right now. I even found Richard Russell when he was traveling in the Soviet Union, senator from my state of Georgia, very complicated man, whatever, but a very, very powerful U.S. senator, who claimed to see UFOs on a train ride somewhere in like outside of Baku, and the Soviets covered up the windows and wouldn't let them look outside because he saw these two discs, and it made it into a declassified CIA cable. So when you start to pull back the onion, you see all these, it's all this innuendo and all of these mealy-mouthed statements, and we need this evidence, but we don't have this evidence, we need this commission, and blah blah blah. But to your point, there's an answer somewhere. Like, does this shit exist or not? And I don't understand why it's so hard. And part of the, you were mentioning philosophy earlier. Like, if this thing does exist, like, would it really stay secret for that long? Like, if somebody had their hands on this, like, I assume that it would be out. And I don't think that we would all start eating each other alive if we knew that somebody had visited the planet from somewhere else. I don't know. It's just very, I get like 85% of the way there, but then the fact that, since time immemorial, we have no actual evidence. It is all just this kind of hysteria, and that, I don't know, it's hard to sort of make it that last step. So I agree with, like, when you look at the politics, when you look at all the scurrying around, it makes you think there's too much smoke for there not to be some kind of fire. But if the fire were actually, we have an alien body in the bottom of the Pentagon, like I can't imagine that would still be secret, you know?
Well, again, I've held TSSCI clearances before. I don't have any active clearances. I never had any firsthand access to these alleged programs. I'll put that down for the record. But there are secrets the government has kept for a long time that are, that have never gotten out, right? Like, the government can keep secrets, right? Especially in this world of special access programs. Like the stuff we've seen leaked from Snowden, it's like those were pretty compartmented stuff. But when you get into like the SAP world, especially the unacknowledged and wave SAP world for like defense and even atomic, like the Department of Energy in particular, like that stuff is a black hole. And so like there is an apparatus that's quite effective at protecting certain things. And the allegations, though, have been that this has leaked. It's just been effectively manipulated through a very sophisticated disinformation campaign where, yeah, maybe as part of those, like, the decades of UFO lore, some bits of truth have filtered out, but it's been surrounded by a miasma of disinformation and made up kooky nonsense. And because you don't have the inside, track, you don't know what's true from not. And so it's there, but no one knows, and adversaries don't know either, right? And so it's effectively a kind of way of mixing the truth in with a bunch of lies, and no one's the wiser. There's another potential factor here, which among any other secret, you could imagine being quite compelling for those briefed into the secret to keep it a secret, right? Which is maybe it's not all that great news, right? Like it's not something you would just want to tell people because it might not be such a good conversation to have, and you would rather have not known about it in the first place, and so it's just not something you want to say, right? It's not like, oh, cool, like we're teleporting ourselves to Mars to have tea with the Alpha Centauri, whatever, right? Like I got a crazy bar story for you, buddy. No, this is like one where you go home and you just drink yourself into a stupor, right? Like it could be that type of secret, right? Which would be very effective at sort of self-containing, right? And that's if you're in the branch of the Bayesian tree where these UAPs represent non-human intelligence, right? Like there's kind of three possibilities, right? It's like benevolent, benign, kind of neutral, and then like hostile, right? And you can kind of just examine this like purely kind of a priori, right? If you're granting the assumption that they're real and they're here for some reason. The fact that they've been around here for a while and let Hiroshima happen, let the Holocaust happen, let decades of wars and almost nuclear, exchanges happen, tells me at least they don't care too much about intervening to save us from murdering each other at scale, right? So like their threshold for benevolence is pretty high, right? We haven't quite met the level where they would intervene to make us all live in a utopia, right? Now they obviously haven't wiped us out, so they're not like super aggressively, like hostile. But that kind of leaves this pretty broad, ambiguous, middle ground where if you assume they're real, you have to stipulate some variation of assumption behind their intention, and it's clearly not, entirely benevolent. At least the historical evidence would say. So that could be a reason why it's stayed secret. The other reason is going back to more like physics, and the more I'd say solid speculation, if this is true, would be when the lesson of World War II was that new physics kind of wins great power war, right? Like it was this sort of synergistic integration of leading scientists, physicists, mainly mathematicians and computer scientists, or the predecessors of computer scientists of the day, cryptographers, that banded together with institutional bureaucracies wedded to the military and intelligence complex that won World War II. And that institutional structure and power arrangement didn't just like disappear after 1945, right? In fact, it was extremely empowered to sort of reconstruct the post-war technological order. And if you imagine that some part of that structure came across super advanced non-human technology, like they would treat the potential physics knowledge gained from that technology as equivalent to, if not more important strategically than the physics knowledge they gained from nuclear physics to turn into a nuclear weapon. That they created an entire separate compartment of secrecy for, right? They created Department of Energy, the Q clearance, restricted data. There's a whole Atomic Energy Act specifically designed to protect physics knowledge from being weaponized. So if you figured out there's maybe this potential source of new physics knowledge that could be weaponized, but in a much more dangerous fashion, then you would treat that, as if not more secretly than you treat, nuclear weapon secrets, which we treat exceptionally secretly. So that would explain why you would have, like the sort of compartments within compartments within compartments, and that maybe it's so secret off the books that certain people over many decades figure out, they can kind of like separate from the normal like apparatus of government oversight, and that sort of feeds on itself over time. And then now we're at this point where, like the rest of the government's waking up to the fact that maybe these secret programs have been running on kind of unsupervised for decades, and now that we're like coming into a strategic competition with China, it's time to like bringing them back under the fold a bit. I don't know, that's speculation.
Well, yeah, I hear you, but then we get into the U.S. centric part of this conversation, which is, if there are visitors here, like they aren't just chilling in like the United States. Like you would assume the Soviets had their own program, and the Chinese have their own program, and everybody else has their own program. And like the Soviet Union collapsed. Anybody who was going to hold the secrets there like wouldn't have the secrets held, and you would think that there would be sort of broader conversations about this. But
well, actually, that did leak out. I mean, there was a journalist, George Knapp, who went to the Soviet Union after it collapsed, and he got basically a whole trove of UAP related documents from Russia, and they were reported on, but no one really cared because it was a few scientists who came out of the Russian apparatus and said, "Here you go, we'll talk about it." And then after like a year or two, that kind of perestroika, ended, and then they all got sucked back into the bureaucracy. So there was like a little window for a very brief period of time into, what the Russians were doing on this, which has been alleged. And in the debrief article that featured David Grush's testimony, the journalist Leslie Klein Ralph Blumenthal also interviewed on the record by name a retired colonel who I believe was at NASIC, National Aerospace Intelligence Command, and he basically confirmed Grush's allegations of there being a, quote, sub-Rosa Cold War for decades, focused on essentially the competitive crash retrieval and reverse engineering of this advanced technology. And that Ross Coulthard has similarly reported on the fact that there's an aggressive counterintelligence campaign operated by the Chinese in Huntsville, Alabama, where, like a large part of our allegedly, programs are located. That's where a lot of the, Operation Paperclip Nazi scientists went as like building up the U.S. sort of rocket force. And, the kind of the second and third generation scientists that were trained by that first generation all stayed around Huntsville. And there's like a little nucleus of like really advanced physicists and rocket scientists there. And actually, there was a big fight to actually move Space Force to Huntsville that Biden just ruled to keep in Colorado. So like Huntsville, Alabama is like a locus. It's like a almost little like mini rocket scientist enclave there. But there's apparently it's a hotbed of Chinese counterintelligence allegedly focused on trying to get access to some of these advanced propulsion system technologies, which may have an origin in some of these, off-book technology of unknown origin reverse engineering programs. So, if you follow the storyline, it at least tells a consistent story, which is that there has been, intense great power competition over trying to get access to these technologies, which might be relatively rare. I don't know why they're crashing. Crashing is a loaded term. It could just be dropped there, right? They could just be given away, gifted. Could just be trash, one-time use sorts of things. Who knows? We have no idea. That's putting yourselves in the minds of whatever the thing is operating this stuff or creating them. But I think it's very weird, like to first order, that we now have these bills in the Senate that are passed that say basically non-human intelligence materials and biological materials. Like why? Can someone ask Schumer, right? Like, why did you put this bill in there? What did you mean when you wanted to say the federal government shall exercise eminent domain over any and all recovered technologies of unknown origin and biological evidence of non-human intelligence that may be controlled by private persons or entities in the interest of the public good? As a citizen in this republic, I want to know why the senator, especially the majority leader, thinks it's necessary to put that into public law. There should be a reason given for why we pass laws in this country. And a law that says that's saying the federal government, my federal government, shall exercise eminent domain over non-human intelligence and biological evidence thereof. I kind of want to know why you put that in law. I think there should be a sufficient, public reason to justify that in law. And we can speculate till the cows come home. But I just don't know why we're not asking Senator Schumer and his staff, what the hell? Like, where did this come from?
Yeah, I mean, I walk away from this with not a lot of certainty about anything. The one thing I think we can say without a shadow of a doubt, and you put your finger right on it, this is weird. Like, it's really weird. I'm not willing to come out and say like one thing or not, but like something weird is happening and I don't understand it. And to your point, like, we should all be talking about it. Why don't we indulge in a little speculation though, which is, what would be the geopolitical impact if any of this is even true? Like, what happens? Like, if we get tomorrow, here is the picture of the 3-foot tall body with the elongated head and the metallic looking cloak or whatever. Like, what happens the day after that photo is produced or that genetic evidence is produced? Anything? Nothing? Like, would it have any impact? Would we all just start looting each other's like stores and things like that? Like, how do you think about what that scenario looks like?
So if I put myself in the position of, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, the White House advisors, like John Podesta, for example, that was trying to push for disclosure in previous administrations and is now a senior advisor to Biden, and I'm trying to like plan a disclosure process that is tightly managed, one of the first considerations is, okay, there's got to be portions of this that we want to make public, and there's portions of this that we don't want to make public, right? So like, I'll give you what I think is the most plausible scenario of where this becomes public, assuming that something like the Grush story is true, right? Mm. Now, in that scenario, I don't think all of the Grush allegations will be part of that first package of disclosure, right? For example, I do not think we will come out and just say we have a whole bunch of like alien bodies and we don't know exactly, how they're made and maybe their DNA and how close that DNA may or may not be to our DNA, for example. Like, these things could get very weird very quickly, and I don't think they're ready to have that conversation. So I think it's more plausible to expect, if this is the trajectory that we're on, to have a controlled disclosure plan, which, by the way, that's the words that they use in the Schumer bill. It says a controlled disclosure plan, where they incrementally bring out these facts, right? The facts that we're at right now, which is that, yes, these are real objects. Yes, they display these advanced capabilities. Yes, we've confirmed that no military or government on this planet makes them. So we strongly suspect that they are non-Earth origin. So that would be what I call like confirmation. At that point, I think they're trying to get to the point where that's kind of like, there's like a wow shrug, right? Where I don't expect there to be much of a official like market or geopolitical reaction if they play their cards right? Just like, everyone just kind of goes, okay, well, what's next? I don't know what to buy or sell. I'm not ready to change my plan or strategy as like a C-suite or as a military officer, right? So like the official sort of structure of human decision-making, I don't think like materially changes, because I don't think people have enough information to know like what to change in their investment or strategic decisions, right? But I think then you're into a different world though, where there are some interesting possibilities that could develop, right? There's like, and to me, there's two main options, right? One is the like, okay, we're going to try to use this for the purposes of broader social and geopolitical comedy, right? The sort of going back to Reagan, Gorbachev, we're all one big human family. Our squabbles won't go away, but now that we know we're not the biggest kid on the block, maybe we need to think about, what our orientation is collectively towards this broader phenomenon that we can't necessarily control or defeat. So what do we do about that? That may tend to suppress what would otherwise be potentially more volatile geopolitical flashpoints, e.g. Taiwan, right? So that if that's the scenario you're in, maybe you then have to discount the risk of a Taiwan invasion, for example, right? Because, under that scenario, there's other priorities and prerogatives that geopolitically take precedent, and it's easy to justify to domestic population in China, for example. Yeah, I know we promised the Taiwanese sort of unification, but like we didn't factor in, sort of this whole thing.
We totally didn't factor in that the 3-body problem was real. Yeah. It
allows a lot of governments to kind of reset the clock on their political promises, but it also potentially possesses a risk to their legitimacy because human beings are fundamentally social hierarchical creatures. We defer to governments because they're the most powerful things around, right? Like kings are the most impressive individuals. They control the most powerful instruments of power of sort of state capability. If there's another entity out there that is now admitted by that government to have more power than it, the sort of natural human social animal inclination is to sort of defer to that as the new authority. Okay, well, why do I have to listen to you? Like, my job is to just try to channel whatever I think the alien being is telling me, kind of like the Lutheran Reformation, undermining the authority of the sort of vertically integrated hierarchical structure of the Pope. Now anyone can have a direct relationship with God, right, and can sort of discern their own truth religiously through direct, interpretation of the liturgy. And that was a fundamentally destabilizing social and political force in Europe. You can imagine a similar version of that where people think, oh, the aliens are out there. They're floating in, the ethereal whatever, right? And there's a whole bunch of people out there that will probably tell you, you can commune directly with your new kind of God King alien that's floating around in space. And you don't need to listen to the government anymore. And the government's admitted that this thing is real. So, game set, right? Like, that would be a fundamentally destabilizing thing for governments to, flirt with, knowing human psychology and how vulnerable we are to different cult belief systems. That's kind of tricky. That's a very tricky thing to manage. You would need to get the broader apparatus of institutions, religious institutions, to kind of come on board and reestablish a kind of a new canonical worldview that everyone kind of accepts, where the existing structures change a bit, but they're fundamentally still legitimate. That's the most important thing I think they need to keep in mind. But that's on the sociological side. For me, the more damaging, destructive side is on the technology end, right? Because it isn't just a matter of human belief at this point changing and the potential consequences for social and political order. It's, well, what new capabilities do we have, access to as a civilization that can fundamentally change, either the positive or negative potential for our lifespan. And as we've seen, we talk about the sort of the LK99, is it or isn't a room temperature superconductor. The reason why that's such a fascinating question is because potentially, if it's true that this compound is an ambient temperature, ambient pressure superconductor, that dramatically opens up the aperture for technologies that could fundamentally change the sort of the substrate of human civilization. And you only get a few of those, right, in in a few centuries. And if it turns out that there's some of things like that, but a few more that are tucked away that could be unleashed on civilization, then we could be in a very, very different sort of forecasting position, right? Because now you have to, it's already, as it's very, very difficult to forecast geopolitics with just nothing else changing, just the normal human, squabbles over resources and stuff. Throw in just crazy advanced accelerating exponential technology and out of left field step function jumps, and it's just a complete scramble to the economic and political order. I have to imagine at a certain point it'll just be looking through a mirror darkly. I hope that we take advantage of it, if this is true, to try to you're not going to get world peace out of this, but at least we can ameliorate some of our tribal divisions. But the sort of angst about technology competition, I could easily see transitioning into this. And in fact, in the bill, in the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence legislation, they explicitly put this in there. It says it is the sense of Congress that, due to the increasing potential for technology surprise from foreign adversaries, and to ensure sufficient integration across the United States industrial base and avoid technology and security stovepipes, quote, the United States industrial base must retain its global lead in critical advanced technologies, and two, the federal government must expand awareness about any historical exotic technology antecedents previously provided by the federal government for research and development purposes. Essentially what they're saying is, China's on the march, rapidly developing to the technology frontier. We have to pull out all the stops to make sure we win in that competition. And now the Congress might have found out that there's secret ace-in-the-hole technologies that have been locked away that maybe Lockheed hasn't fully been able to exploit because they kept it so secret. So now we need to get more research and scientists from maybe big tech, academia, kind of in the tent to make sure that China doesn't get the jump on us. Because, for example, if by hypothesis China has some of these materials, they might have 10,000 engineers, pouring over it. We might have 1,000, right? And that 10-to-1 advantage has to keep up some of the strategic planners, keep them up at night. It's what if China figures something out about this stuff before we do, right? There's that, and that is a dynamic that I think, in the national security space, that always supervenes over any blah, 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 human story, one big family, yada, yada, yada. It's like, no, we need to get the most cutting edge technology or else.
Well, I mean, to your point, I'm sure everybody's watching Oppenheimer now or thinking about Oppenheimer and nuclear weapons in general. I mean, I usually say this in some of my briefings and my speeches. I often talk about, I usually put up a picture of Niels Bohr's, description of the inside of the atom. And I talk about how Niels Bohr went into science, and his biggest goal was he thought if he could find an inexhaustible energy source, there would be no more war and no more poverty. And the next slide is always a mushroom cloud. And it says, so we took Niels Bohr's inexhaustible energy source and we made bombs out of it. So if you think that technological progress is going to lead to us all beating our swords into plowshares and singing Kumbaya, it usually doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, human history doesn't show us that. But I'm glad you brought up the superconductor thing, because I've been thinking about that as well, and listeners might not even be familiar with it. I actually brought it up to some of the other research folks at CI, and I was usually I'm a little bit behind the curve when it comes to this stuff, because I'm focusing more on underwater basket weaving and how it's affected by the coup in Niger. But I brought this up because I've been getting so many questions about this the superconductor thing. And on the one hand, like, yes, it looks like there's some very interesting things that have happened. Maybe it'll pan out, maybe it won't pan out. But there is sort of a gullibility in it's not even modern society, going back hundreds of years, where we believe crazy shit. Like, we burn witches at the stake because we think that they're communing with evil forces. 5G causes COVID. Vaccines cause autism. You kind of go down we've got the superconductor. We've got the whole thing figured out. You can make it in your backyard in 3 days. It was all just waiting around for somebody to put the right things together. Like, there's this gullibility in our society right now, which I guess has always been there, that we want to latch on to these glittering things to give meaning or to make sense out of life. I don't know. And part of me wants to throw everything that's happening into that bucket. But, going back to the point about weirdness, there's just too much weirdness kind of to really do that. But there is that, like, when we're talking about this, part of me is thinking, are the aliens just like playing chess and watching us all freak out? And then part of me is just like, man, the human capacity for hysteria really knows no bounds. The fact that we're wasting our time here talking about aliens at all is like just an example of how much we've been infected by hysteria. And I don't know what to do with it all. All I know is that it's weird.
Yeah, and I think you see this across, I look for like practical case studies of where I see a topic go from fringe, niche, like sneering dismissal to now like center of policy discourse. And one of them has been, and it's like in keeping with this kind of like quasi-accelerationist technology weirdness. And it's an AI, obviously, right? Which has been the one thing that if you look, say, 12 or 18 months ago, like the idea of there being like a major strategic policy discussion on like the risks, civilizational, existential risks of runaway artificial general intelligence would have been like, oh, you're in sort of the less wrong blog world debating with a bunch of other nerds about like some hypothetical scenario. And now you've got like, meetings at the White House and major national summits being proposed and like big packages of legislation being discussed. And that's like pretty quick. That was like a 12-month shift from being like, no, like you're a weirdo. Don't talk to me about that crazy thing. Go off on your internet blog, to like, can you come to the White House, please, and brief the president on what you're worried about, right? Like that tells me that, at least we should implicitly think that, again, it's like hard to like adjust your priors because not everything that's in that tail scenario is going to move into the center, right? And so it's like, where do you set the false positive threshold point, right? And COVID is another example, very different in terms of the characteristic dynamics of a virus spreading. But like, if you were, say, more inclined to be like hyper reactive to like a little signal in a large amount of noise, then, you look at a few case counts coming out of Wuhan in January and you're like, I'm going to Costco, right? And, there's two types of those people. There's like the person who's like deeply connected into the intelligence apparatus, who has like deep sources and methods that are saying this is undercounted, there's a cover-up underway, the government is treating this like it's a major problem, like I'm going to tell my friends and family to like get ready. And then there's like the tinfoil hat guy who goes, oh, the Chinese government, this is a bioweapon, it's coming out of the Wuhan lab. It's like, okay, completely different motivations, maybe epistemically one grounded, one not so grounded, but they effectively did the same early proper decision making, right? Whereas like the midwit normie, no, until it comes to the New York Times, CNN headline, I just sort of outsource my epistemic filter to these institutions where it'll have to go through enough gates, of like, other people concreting on the same idea for it to like be serious to me. And that's probably a safe strategy for most people, right? But if you're in the job of like anticipating events, if you're in the job of trying to prepare for those tail risk scenarios, and advise people on the fact, you kind of have to always be looking at those like parts of the tails, and you have to like really try to calibrate your sense of like, where's the signal in this noise, and how early is too early to react to a little hint, right? And that's why I think the UAP conversation is like it's crossing over that threshold to me, because I see these indicators and I've been paying really close attention to them, and it's like, okay, it's not being treated any less seriously than it was a year ago. In fact, it's like almost becoming exponentially more serious as a policy topic, and now it's like sort of entering into the normie discourse, being like, a few like hits on Sunday news programs and New York Times articles. It's like, okay, this is the characteristic pattern I would expect if for something to sort of go through this evolution. And so I think we're kind of moving that direction. And these other things haven't quite gotten there yet. So like the semiconductor one is like super very early on, right? It's a bunch of people on social media sharing preprints and, rumors and like some, picture of what is that thing actually levitating? Like, what is this? Oh, wait, an hour ago, Argonne National Lab just put out, like a simulation that proves that it has, like these these like Fermi bands, right? Where it's characteristic of sort of superconductor behavior. Okay, like if like you could just ignore all that and wait for a few weeks and we'll probably know, right? But if your job is to like try to figure out something immediately before everyone else does, to try to capture the alpha, right? You might call this like for example, I think our buddy, the geopolitical alpha, it's like you're trying to capture the sort of the epistemic alpha, the sort of technological volatility alpha, or just like the weirdness alpha. Then you kind of have to be really zoomed in to those parts of the curve that are very murky, and you have to be comfortable kind of having a good set of epistemic heuristics that you refine over time, and never pre-committing to a particular view, because when you're out in the tails, it doesn't take a lot of information to change radically, what your assumptions are about the future.
No, I mean, methodologically, you're right. It's a very thin line between appearing absolutely deranged and actually doing the work of imagining something that everybody else thinks is silly. So, usually when we're talking about these sorts of things, if you're out in front, for a long time, people will tell you that you're full of shit and you have no idea what you're talking about. And as Roger Baker, who's been on this podcast and trained me, 9 out of 10 times you'll be wrong. But like if you're doing this discipline, you also have to have enough. It's weird. It's being an analyst, I find you need a remarkable combination of self-confidence and humility at the same time. You have to have enough self-confidence to record an hour and 5-minute podcast about the potential of aliens, but also enough humility to be at the end and say like, well, I don't know. And if I'm wrong tomorrow. And I talked about what I talked about. We got to move on to the next thing to imagine the future.
Yeah, it's one of those things where depends on what your motivation is, right? If your motivation is to make a bet, if your motivation is to personally prepare psychologically, if your motivation is to engage policymakers or just intellectual curiosity, like you have to understand what your motivation is to investigate a question in the first place, to know like what your standards of evidence need to be, right? If you're just a casual onlooker and your life isn't going to change or any of your decisions are going to change, then I think you should have a pretty high bar, right? Because, you don't need to make any radical decisions or changes in your lifestyle. You just like, okay, if this is true, well then whatever happens, I can't do anything about it, right? I'll just like react to it when it comes. Maybe like in our jobs, right, we have to like always look at those branches of the tree and be like, well, if the branch of the tree is this one, I have to look at that what if. Because then my clients are going to be calling me the next morning being like, okay, I ignored you on that alien thing for a while, but now that it's like for real, like what the hell, right? And it's like, okay, I don't want to be like that thinking about that for the first time, when everyone else is, right? And it's just, it's also a fascinating question, right? Like, of course, objectively speaking, it would be quite an ontological shock if it were true. Stay tuned, I would say, and read the bill. Yeah.
Well, yeah, read the bill. I don't know how much of a shock it would be. I mean, the odds are that we're not alone. The odds are that there are like living sentient civilizations out there, or have been at some point, or will be somehow. I mean, it just doesn't make sense that maybe we're the only ones in this point in time, or the only ones that technology allows us to travel between. I don't know that it would change. The only thing that would change things is if we have some kind of contact with a civilization that can interact with us, or communicate with us, or can control us in some kind of way. To your point about the benign malevolent or even friendly sort of thing. If it's just, hey, like, this is a probe from some distant civilization that's been, supernovaed like however many hundreds of millions of years ago, like, it's probably not going to change them.
Which actually, I'll finish on one semi-speculative point, which is on that exact inference, right? You have to follow that through line, right? The fact that you just made that claim that, yeah, if they acknowledge that these are non-human intelligence vehicles and, nothing is dramatically going to shift in my worldview, well, then why haven't they admitted that fact? Just that fact alone, right? Unless it's a little bit more complicated than that. And that it's not as simple as just saying there's other advanced intelligence that's visiting from another planet. There could be other weirdness involved that might not be so easy to discuss on a mass scale. And so, yeah, that's not a reassuring inference potentially. So this is why I was saying, like, the ontological shock is not just about whether are we alone or not. I think people have kind of accommodated themselves to that now, right? There's thousands of exoplanets we've discovered, and it's just a matter of, okay, advanced physics to zip around the universe. It's a little bit more potentially of a nuanced story. Was if they've been here, how long have they been here? How long have they been watching, interacting, manipulating? Like, these are all the questions then you're forced to reckon with if you've accepted that first basic fact that they're here and they're real and they've been here for a while. It's like, well, what have they been doing this whole time? And that is a very uncomfortable set of questions that, quickly gets you to the, Alex Jones territory. And I don't think we're ready to do that right yet.
No, probably not. Although I'm shocked that nobody in this discourse has brought up the most convincing evidence that aliens do exist, which is that Prince was on this earth for a while and gifted us with whatever music was in his head. So, Matt, we will wish you well on your journey, and we'll have you back in a couple weeks, hopefully.
Yeah, stay tuned.
All right. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.